Thank you, Mr. Acting Chairman. Appreciate it.
First time. Big promotion.
As we're sitting here, news feeds often come across, and I just saw one that the Department of Defense has indicated in its 2025 procurement plan to buy $400 million worth of Tesla trucks. I'm going to just let that fact sink in. That's all I'm going to say about that. Admiral, you talked about the activity of the Chinese in Latin America. Would you believe, do you believe that that activity is, number one, significant, and number two, increasing? And the nature of the activity, as I understand it, is public works projects, ports, 2 ports in Panama, for example. Is this significant activity on behalf of China in Latin America?
Yes, Senator. I think all their efforts from a infrastructure standpoint, the development of dual-use sites and facilities is a challenge, and we should be concerned about that.
I would point out to the committee that 2 weeks ago, we unilaterally disarmed in Latin America when we destroyed the Agency for International Development, because that's the agency that provides funds for these kinds of projects. So we've left the field in Latin America, and I think that should be understood. We're always talking about competition with China and the pacing threat, but here is a place where we basically have, as I say, left the field. We've abdicated, we've surrendered to China in Latin America by unilaterally and illegally and unconstitutionally abandoning the vehicle by which we were competing with them in terms of development and work in Latin America. I think that should be noted. We've gone almost entirely through this hearing and not talked much about terrorism. I believe that in all the talk about pivoting to great power competition in the Indo-Pacific, we've taken our eye off terrorism. And it worries me that that's still a threat. General, is terrorism still a threat to this country? I believe you mentioned lone wolves, which is the most difficult kind of terrorism to combat.
Senator, it is still a threat and a concern, and one of the primary focuses in the NORTHCOM part of my job. To address that, we have very close ties with Central Command and Special Operations Command to follow their operations in overseas, and they give me any indication of activities moving towards the United States that we'd have to plan for. And of course, we have great relations across the intel and interagency to ensure that we have a consolidated look at any terror threats to the U.S.
Well, I hope that there is a significant emphasis, because I worry that this is one of those things we're going to wake up and find ourselves under attack, and everybody's going to say, well, what happened? And it's a matter of taking our eye off the terrorism ball. That's one of the greatest threats to this country, particularly if terrorists get a hold of nuclear material. And there's a growing nuclear family, including Iran and North Korea, where nuclear material might become available. And that's the nightmare scenario, because deterrence doesn't work with terrorists. They don't care about dying, and they don't have a capital city to destroy. So intelligence and awareness of what the terrorists are thinking and planning and plotting, I think, is absolutely critical. Admiral, every year when we have this hearing, I talk to the Southcom commander about the fact that we have intelligence reports about drug shipments coming to the U.S. in the maritime domain, and we have the assets to interdict 25% of them. To me, that is just straight up unconscionable. There are people dying in my state from fentanyl overdoses, from drug overdoses generally, and we're not meeting, because of a lack of basically allocation of assets, the drug shipments that we know about. That's what's so objectionable about this. Is that percentage still reasonable? 75% is not being interdicted that we know of?
Yes, sir. About 10 to 20% is what we can get after what we see. Yes, sir.
And that's because of a lack of assets. Is that not correct? There's just not enough. We don't have enough boats, ships.
Yeah, primary lack of assets, the lack of resources, ISR capability. Yes, sir.
Well, I would argue that, again, this is a misallocation of resources, that here is a active attack on America that's killing our citizens, and we don't have enough ships and whether it's Coast Guard or Navy in the region to interdict these drug shipments. I think that's basically it's a dereliction of duty, not of you, but of the entire policy apparatus. And this goes back 3-4 administrations. But it's one that I hope that this administration might pay some attention to and correct. Maybe there's a second round. We'll talk about icebreakers, General. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator King. One thing, was it state or defense that bought the Teslas, do you know?
My understanding, it was the Department of Defense, armored Tesla Cybertrucks.
Okay.
One follow-up. General, give us an outline of the Russian activity and militarization of the northern Arctic Ocean. I don't know how to define northern and southern when you're coming from the North Pole, but on the Russian shoreline.
Senator, over the last year, we've seen a significant increase in both Russian air and maritime activity in the vicinity of Alaska, both in the Bering and up in the Arctic Ocean. In fact, the incursions and the number of ships this past year equal or exceeded the rate that it was before the Ukraine invasion, after which I think we all know the numbers dropped. And we've also seen increase in air patrols on the eastern side, what we call the 2 o'clock approach through the Greenland and Iceland gap towards Maine and the northeast portion of the United States. So I'm certainly concerned by that, and I would expect the numbers on both sides of our coast to increase in the coming year. And then also, sir, along those lines, also the Russian out-of-area patrols for both surface and undersea was significant last year, and I expect to see that on both coasts again this
And
year.
the Chinese are increasingly active, are they not?
Yes, sir. Last year we saw the most Chinese vessels off the coast of Alaska than we've ever seen, and many simultaneously.
I was at a conference some years ago on the Arctic, and there was a huge delegation from China, and I said, what is China's interest? They said, we are a near Arctic nation. My response was, Maine is a near Caribbean state. They are very active and increasing their actions. Now, how about, where are we? Do we have a port for a facility, for example, in the Arctic? And secondly, give us a breakdown of the status of icebreakers. We are woefully inadequate in terms of icebreakers, particularly for the use of the Northwest Passage.
Senator, I was going to use the same word. We're in a woeful situation with icebreakers. The Coast Guard is working very hard to increase that for us, but at this time, we're completely outnumbered with icebreakers.
But they're building one new icebreaker, but it's really merely a replacement for the ancient one that's about to go out of service. Is that not correct?
It is. And
So there's no net gain in icebreakers.
That's right, Senator.
And the icebreakers we have commute between the Arctic and the Antarctic. Is that not correct?
That's correct as well.
And how many icebreakers do you estimate the Russians have in the Arctic?
Between 20 and 40.
20 and 40 to less than one. I would argue that the icebreakers are the essential infrastructure of the Arctic region, and to say we are inadequate and behind where we should be is, I believe, an understatement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.